Blackwater Gulch, Montana Territory, 1885. The midsummer sun beat down on Fletcher Baxter's shoulders as he guided his sorrel stallion across the parched valley. At 26, he had the kind of face that made saloon girls sigh, square-jawed with piercing blue eyes that seemed to catch every movement on the horizon, a testament to years spent watching for trouble. His light brown hair curled slightly beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and 3 days of stubble shadowed his tanned face. The cattle drive had been brutal. 2 months on the trail had hollowed his cheeks and hardened muscles already lean from years in the saddle. But Fletcher wasn't thinking about the drive as he urged his horse faster. He was thinking about home. If the solitary cabin he'd built with his own hands could be called that. A man needs nothing but his horse, his gun, and open country. His father had told him before dying in a senseless saloon brawl when Fletcher was 14. It was a lesson he'd taken to heart. The West was no place for sentiment. Love was a distraction that got men killed, and Fletcher had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. The rolling hills of the Blackwater Valley came into view, and Fletcher allowed himself a rare smile. The land spoke to him in a way people never had. It was honest, demanding but fair. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. Unlike people, as Fletcher crested the final hill overlooking his modest spread, 200 acres with a small cabin, barn, and corral, he pulled his horse up short. There was smoke rising from his chimney. Someone was in his home. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached cautiously. No outlaw would be fool enough to make himself so obvious, which meant it was likely someone from town. Only a handful of people would dare make themselves at home in his absence. When Fletcher pushed open the door, the scent hit him first, fresh-baked bread and something sweet. Then he saw her. "Bridget," he said, his voice rough from trailed dust. Bridget Foster turned from the stove, her face breaking into a radiant smile that transformed her already beautiful features. At 23, she had grown into a woman whose presence could stop conversations when she entered a room. Her dark blonde hair was piled atop her head in a practical bun, with errant tendrils framing her heart-shaped face. She wore a simple blue calico dress that somehow made her eyes, the color of Montana summer skies, seem even more vivid. "Fletcher Baxter, you're a week late, and you look like something the coyotes wouldn't bother with," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "What are you doing here, Bridget?" Fletcher set his hat on the table, conscious of the trail grime coating his clothes and skin. "What I've done every time you've returned from a cattle drive since you built this place. Making sure you have something proper to eat besides jerky and beans." She turned back to the stove. "There's hot water for washing up. You smell like you slept with your horse." Fletcher couldn't help the slight upward turn of his lips. They'd known each other since childhood, the doctor's daughter and the ranch hand's son, unlikely friends in the small frontier town of Blackwater Gulch. When most girls were learning to set a proper table, Bridget had been riding bareback alongside Fletcher, exploring every hill and valley within a day's ride. As he washed the trail dust from his face and hands in the basin she'd prepared, Fletcher considered how easily Bridget had always fit into his space, never demanding more than he could give. Their friendship was the one relationship he hadn't managed to ruin. "I ran into Abel Foster in town," she said, referring to her older brother. "He told me you'd be back soon, so I rode out yesterday. Someone needs to make sure you don't waste away to nothing." She set a plate of venison stew before him. "Eat before it gets cold." Fletcher didn't argue. The stew was the first home-cooked meal he'd had in months, and he ate with the focus of a starving man. "The drive went well?" she asked, sitting across from him. "Well enough. Got a fair price in Cheyenne." Fletcher kept his eyes on his food, thinking of expanding the herd next spring. Alone? The question hung in the air between them. A man can handle a small spread on his own. "A man can die alone too," she replied softly. Fletcher looked up then, caught by something in her voice. "Been managing fine so far." "Have you?" Her eyes held his, challenging in a way that made him shift uncomfortably. Before he could respond, hoofbeats approached outside. Fletcher was on his feet in an instant, hand on his gun. Old habits died hard on the frontier. The door burst open to reveal Abel Foster, Bridget's brother and the town's deputy sheriff. His face was grim. "Fletcher, we need you. Jameson's boy is missing, wandered off while they were fixing fence lines. Storm's coming in fast from the north. Every man who can ride is joining the search." Fletcher was already reaching for his hat. My spare mount is rested. I'm coming too, Bridget said, already untying her apron. No. Both men spoke in unison. Her eyes flashed. That child is 7 years old. I've known him since he was born, and I can track as well as either of you. It's not proper, Bridget, her brother argued. Proper won't find that boy before the storm hits. She was already pulling on her riding jacket. Fletcher knew that determined set of her jaw. We're wasting time arguing, he said to Abel. Let's go. The storm clouds were gathering on the horizon as 3 riders galloped north toward the Jameson property. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Fletcher estimated they had 3 hours at most before the storm broke. He was last seen near Cottonwood Creek. Abel shouted over the thunder of hooves. Fletcher nodded. He knew the area well. Dangerous terrain with steep ravines that could trap an inexperienced rider or a frightened child. As they approached the meeting point where a dozen other searchers had gathered, he felt a growing sense of dread. These mountains were unforgiving to the unwary. The search party split into pairs, each assigned a section of territory. Fletcher found himself riding with Bridget after Abel was called away by the sheriff to coordinate the eastern search. They headed northwest, following the creek upstream where it narrowed between rocky cliffs. He's a smart boy, Bridget said as they dismounted to check a series of tracks along the muddy bank. Timothy knows these hills. Smart doesn't stop hypothermia, Fletcher replied grimly, examining the small footprints that headed toward a narrow canyon. These are fresh. He came this way. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they followed the tracks into the canyon. The temperature was plummeting, and Fletcher pulled off his heavy coat, handing it to Bridget despite her protests. You're shivering already, he said. Won't do the boy any good if we both freeze looking for him. The tracks led them deeper into unfamiliar territory. Fletcher had hunted these canyons, but never fully explored the maze of passages that cut through the mountains. As the rain intensified, the ground became treacherous, and twice Bridget nearly fell on the slick rocks. The second time, Fletcher caught her around the waist, pulling her against him. For a moment, they stood frozen, faces inches apart, her breath warm against his cold cheek. Then he steadied her and moved ahead, trying to ignore the lingering warmth where her body had pressed against his. Fletcher, Bridget's voice cut through the drumming rain. Look! A small cave opening was visible in the canyon wall, and huddled inside was a small, shivering form. Timothy Jameson looked up with tear-streaked face as they approached, his relief palpable. I got lost, he sobbed as Bridget gathered him into her arms. I was trying to find my pa's horse that got loose, but then I couldn't find my way back. You're safe now, she soothed, wrapping Fletcher's coat around the boy. Fletcher surveyed their situation with growing concern. The rain had become a downpour, and the canyon floor was already accumulating runoff water. We can't go back the way we came. Flash flood danger. Bridget's eyes widened in understanding. Is there another way out? These canyons usually have multiple outlets, Fletcher said, though he was less confident than he sounded. We need to go higher. With Timothy between them, they began climbing the steep canyon wall toward a narrow ledge that seemed to lead around the bend. The rock was slippery, and progress was painfully slow. When they finally reached the ledge, Fletcher took the lead, testing each step before allowing Bridget and the boy to follow. The ledge widened into a natural shelf that curved around the canyon wall, eventually leading to higher ground above the flood zone. As they emerged from the canyon, the full force of the storm hit them, howling wind driving freezing rain that stung like needles. My cabin is closer than town, Fletcher shouted over the wind. We need to get him warmed up. They managed to reach the horses, which Fletcher had fortunately tied in a sheltered spot. The ride back was a blur of cold and wet misery, with Timothy huddled against Fletcher's chest under his slicker, the boy's small body shivering violently. By the time they reached the cabin, darkness had fallen completely. Fletcher kicked the door open, carrying Timothy directly to the fireplace where embers still glowed from Bridget's earlier cooking fire. Within minutes, Bridget had the fire roaring again while Fletcher wrapped the boy in every blanket he owned. The storm's too severe to get him back to town tonight, Fletcher said, peeling off his soaked shirt. We're all staying here. Bridget nodded, already preparing hot coffee. I need to get him out of these wet clothes. Fletcher turned away to give them privacy, using the time to change into dry clothes himself. When he turned back, Timothy was bundled in one of Fletcher's flannel shirts that hung past the boy's knees. sipping coffee sweetened with honey near the fire. You should change too, Fletcher told Bridget, gesturing to her soaked dress. There's shirts in the trunk. She hesitated only briefly before taking one of his shirts and disappearing behind the privacy screen Fletcher had built years ago at her insistence. When she emerged, her wet hair hung loose down her back, and Fletcher's shirt reached nearly to her knees. Something primitive stirred within him at the sight, and he quickly busied himself stoking the fire. We need to get word to the search party and Timothy's parents, Bridget said, hanging her dress near the fire to dry. No one's riding in this, Fletcher replied, moving to the window where rain lashed against the glass. First light, I'll fire 3 shots. Signal we found him safe. Hours later, after Timothy had fallen asleep on Fletcher's bed, Bridget and Fletcher sat before the fire, the only sound the crackling of flames and the howl of wind outside. You were remarkable out there today, Bridget said quietly. Most men wouldn't have spotted those tracks in that terrain. Fletcher shrugged uncomfortably. You were the one who saw the cave. Why do you do that? She asked, turning to face him fully. Do what? Deflect any kindness like it's an attack. Her eyes reflected the firelight, making them seem to burn with an inner fire of their own. You've been doing it for years. Fletcher stared into the flames. Kindness is just disappointment waiting to happen. Is that what your father taught you? Her voice was gentle but probing. He taught me to rely on myself. Fletcher's jaw tightened. Everything else is just asking for trouble. And yet you risked your life today for a child you barely know. Fletcher had no answer for that. The silence stretched between them. Do you remember when we were 16, Bridget finally said, and you took the blame for breaking Mr. Henderson's window? Fletcher looked up, surprised by the change of subject. That was a lifetime ago. It was me who threw that rock, she continued. But you stepped forward and took the punishment. 3 weeks of mucking out Henderson's stables. You had your nursing apprenticeship with Doc Miller. You couldn't afford to lose the position. That's my point, Fletcher. You've always protected everyone around you. Me, Abel, now Timothy. But who protects you? The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortable and exposing. Fletcher stood abruptly. We should get some rest. Long ride back to town tomorrow. Bridget's hand caught his wrist as he turned away. Don't, she whispered. Don't walk away again. Fletcher froze, caught between the ingrained habit of emotional retreat and the warmth of her touch. Bridget, I've watched you build walls for years, she said, rising to stand before him. After your father died. After your mother left. After each friend who moved away or died. Each time, the walls got higher. Walls keep people safe, Fletcher said roughly. Do they? Her eyes searched his. Or do they just keep people lonely? Before he could respond, she reached up and placed her palm against his cheek. The simple touch sent a jolt through him more powerful than lightning. How long had it been since anyone had touched him with such tenderness? What do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. Just you, she answered simply. I've only ever wanted you. The revelation struck Fletcher with the force of a physical blow. Memories cascaded through his mind. Bridget bringing food whenever he returned from drives. Bridget tending his wounds after bar fights. Bridget always there, steady as the mountains, while he'd been blind to what was right before him. Why, he managed. Because beneath all that stubborn pride and fierce independence is a man who would ride into a storm for a lost child. A man who builds a life with his bare hands and asks for nothing. A man who sees me, truly sees me, not as the doctor's daughter, but as myself. Fletcher caught her hand in his, afraid to believe what he was hearing. I have nothing to offer a woman like you. You have everything I've ever wanted, she replied. But you've never seen it. The realization of how long she must have carried these feelings struck him with a kind of horror. How many years? He asked. A sad smile touched her lips. Since I was 17. 6 years of watching you keep the world at arm's length. 6 years of hoping you might someday look at me and see more than your childhood friend. 6 years. The weight of her unspoken feelings hung between them like a physical presence. All this time, while he'd convinced himself that solitude was safety, she had been waiting patiently for him to realize what had been before him all along. I never thought, he began, but she shook her head. You never allowed yourself to think, she corrected gently. There's a difference. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself were emphasizing the tumult within Fletcher's heart. Everything he'd believed about himself and his place in the world was being challenged by the woman standing before him. The woman who had always been there, whose presence he'd taken for granted like the air he breathed. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Do what? Be what someone else needs." Bridget's laugh was soft, without mockery. "Fletcher Baxter, you've been what I've needed since we were children. You just never let yourself believe it was possible." She stepped closer, and Fletcher felt his carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble. Years of telling himself that the frontier was no place for love, that he was better off alone, that attachment only led to pain. All of it seemed to dissolve under her steady gaze. A cry from the bed interrupted the charged moment. Timothy was thrashing in his sleep, caught in a nightmare. Bridget moved immediately to the boy's side, soothing him with gentle words and a cool hand on his forehead until he settled back into peaceful sleep. Fletcher watched her, seeing with new eyes the natural grace with which she cared for others. It was the same care she'd always shown him, he realized, care he'd never fully acknowledged or returned. "We should sleep," Bridget said, returning to the fire. "He'll need to be returned to his parents at first light." Fletcher nodded, unable to find words for the emotions churning within him. He offered Bridget the only chair with a blanket while he took the floor near the fire. As he lay in the darkness listening to the storm and Bridget's soft breathing, Fletcher felt something shift inside him, like a stone dislodging to reveal a spring beneath. Morning arrived with clear skies and a transformed landscape. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving everything glistening in the early sunlight. Timothy woke full of excitement about his adventure, seemingly recovered from his ordeal thanks to youth's resilience. After firing the signal shots to alert the search parties, Fletcher saddled the horses for the ride to town. Timothy rode with Bridget, chattering happily about how he would tell his friends about being rescued. They were met on the outskirts of Blackwater Gulch by a search party led by Sheriff Collins and Timothy's parents. The reunion was emotional, with Timothy's mother alternating between scolding her son and thanking his rescuers through tears. "You two did a fine thing," Sheriff Collins said to Fletcher and Bridget as the Jamesons departed. "Boy might not have survived the night out there in that storm." Fletcher merely nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. "There's going to be a celebration at the Sullivan place tonight," the sheriff continued. "Town wants to thank everyone who helped with the search. You'll both be there." Before Fletcher could decline, Bridget answered, "We'll be there, Sheriff." The sheriff departed, leaving Fletcher and Bridget alone on the road outside town. "I never agreed to any celebration," Fletcher said, frowning. "No, but you're coming anyway," Bridget replied with quiet certainty. "It's time you stopped hiding from the fact that people care about you." "I don't hide." "Yes, you do." She turned her horse to face his directly. "And after last night, I'm done pretending not to notice." The reference to their interrupted conversation brought heat to Fletcher's face. In the daylight, the intensity of the previous night seemed both more distant and more real. "Bridget, what happened?" "Nothing happened," she interrupted. "Nothing has happened for 6 years, Fletcher. That's the problem." With that, she nudged her horse forward, leaving Fletcher to follow or not. After a moment's hesitation, he followed. The celebration at the Sullivan Ranch was already in full swing when Fletcher arrived that evening. He'd spent the day at his cabin, torn between the habit of isolation and Bridget's challenge to stop hiding. In the end, her words had proven stronger than his inclination to retreat. The large barn had been cleared for dancing, with lanterns hanging from the rafters casting a warm glow over the assembled townspeople. A small band played in one corner, and tables of food and drink lined the walls. Fletcher stood in the doorway, uncomfortable with the press of people but scanning the crowd for one face in particular. "Didn't think you'd come," Abel Foster said, appearing at his elbow with 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Fletcher. "Bridget said you would, but I had my doubts." Fletcher accepted the drink with a nod of thanks. "Where is she?" Abel gave him a curious look. "Over there, talking to the widow Parker." Fletcher spotted her immediately, standing near the punch table in a dress he'd never seen before, deep green that made her blonde hair seem to glow in the lamplight. She was laughing at something the older woman had said, her face animated in a way that caught at something in Fletcher's chest. "You know," Abel said casually, "my sisters had offers from half the eligible men in the county. Turned them all down flat." Fletcher tore his gaze from Bridget to look at her brother. Why are you telling me this? Abel shrugged. Might be I've watched her pine after you since she was old enough to know what pining was. Might be I'm tired of watching. Before Fletcher could respond, Abel clapped him on the shoulder and walked away, leaving Fletcher with the uncomfortable realization that he might have been the only one blind to Bridget's feelings all these years. The band struck up a livelier tune, and couples moved to the center of the barn for a dance. Fletcher worked his way around the edge of the crowd toward Bridget, stopping occasionally when people insisted on thanking him for finding the Jameson boy. When he finally reached her, she was alone, watching the dancers with a small smile. "You came," she said without looking at him. "You said I should." Now she turned, her eyes assessing him. "And do you always do what I say?" "Apparently not often enough," he replied, surprising himself with the admission. A shadow of uncertainty crossed her face. "Fletcher, about last night, dance with me," he interrupted, extending his hand. Surprise registered in her eyes, but she placed her hand in his without hesitation. Fletcher led her to the edge of the dance floor, placing one hand at the small of her back as they joined the other couples. "I didn't know you could dance," she said as he guided her through the steps with unexpected grace. "My mother insisted I learn before she left," he replied. "Said no son of hers would embarrass her by clopping around like a draft horse." Bridget's eyebrows rose. "You never talk about her." "Not much to say. She decided Chicago offered more than a widowed life in Montana territory." Fletcher's voice was neutral, but Bridget wasn't fooled. It must have been hard, losing both parents in different ways. Fletcher's steps faltered slightly before he recovered. "It was a long time ago. Is that when you decided it was safer not to need anyone?" The directness of her question struck him like a physical blow. The music seemed to fade as Fletcher looked into her eyes, seeing the understanding there. "Maybe," he admitted. "Seems foolish now." "Not foolish," she corrected gently. "Just afraid. There's a difference." The dance ended, and other couples moved past them toward the refreshments, but Fletcher and Bridget remained where they were, something unspoken passing between them. "Walk with me," he asked, nodding toward the open barn doors where the night air beckoned. Outside, the stars spread across the Montana sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. They walked in silence to the edge of the Sullivan property where a split-rail fence separated the yard from the open pasture beyond. The music and laughter from the barn were muted by distance, creating a pocket of privacy in the vast night. "I've been thinking about what you said," Fletcher began, leaning against the fence. "About walls keeping people lonely." Bridget stood beside him, her face lifted to the stars. And I think you're right." The admission felt like stepping into unknown territory without a map. "The walls I built after my father died, after my mother left, they protected me from hurt, but they kept everything else out too." "Including me?" Her voice was soft, almost lost in the night breeze. "Especially you." Fletcher turned to face her fully. "You were always the one who could have breached them, Bridget. Maybe that's why I kept you at the furthest distance." She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting starlight. "I'm not going anywhere, Fletcher. I never have been." The simple truth of her words struck him with unexpected force. Through all the years of his self-imposed isolation, Bridget had remained constant, bringing food to his cabin, tending his injuries, offering friendship when he would accept nothing more. "Why?" he asked, the question that had haunted him since her confession. "Why would you waste years waiting for someone who couldn't see what was right in front of him?" "Because I saw you," she answered simply. "Not the walls you built or the distance you maintained, the real you. The boy who took punishment for a broken window to protect me. The man who rides into storms to save lost children. The person who builds something from nothing with his bare hands and never asks for recognition." Fletcher felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the open night around them. "I don't deserve that kind of faith." "That's not for you to decide," she replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "I choose where to place my faith, Fletcher Baxter. I always have." Something broke loose inside him then, a final resistance giving way like ice in spring thaw. Fletcher reached for her, drawing her to him with a gentleness that belied the storm of emotions within him. His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Bridget Foster," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "you've always been the one. I was just too blind to see it." Her eyes widened at his words, a tremulous smile touching her lips. "Say that again." "You've always been the one," he repeated, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. The only one. When he kissed her, it was nothing like Fletcher had imagined during the long, lonely nights he'd denied himself even the thought of her. It was coming home after a lifetime of wandering. It was finding shelter in the heart of a storm. It was truth after years of lies he'd told himself. Bridget's arms wound around his neck, her body pressing against his as she returned his kiss with a passion that stole his breath. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, foreheads resting against each other. "Do you know how long I've waited for you to look at me like this?" she whispered. "Too long," he answered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm sorry for that." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just don't make me wait anymore." The weeks that followed transformed Fletcher's life in ways he could never have anticipated. Bridget became a regular presence at his cabin, often staying late into the evening as they talked of everything and nothing. Each time she prepared to leave, it became harder for Fletcher to watch her go, the cabin feeling emptier in her absence. Their courtship became the talk of Blackwater Gulch, with most expressing surprise only that it had taken so long. Abel Foster had given Fletcher a hard look and a simple warning. "Hurt her, and they'll never find your body." But the threat had been followed by a grin and a handshake that felt suspiciously like approval. Fletcher found himself drawn into the community in ways he'd always avoided before. Sharing meals with the Fosters, attending church services, offering help when the Miller farm needed a new roof. Each social connection was a small victory over the isolation he'd cultivated for so long, with Bridget by his side, encouraging without pushing. One evening in late September, Fletcher rode into town with purpose in his heart and a small box in his pocket. He'd spent the morning in the workshop behind his cabin, crafting something that now represented his future, or what he hoped would be his future. He found Bridget at her father's house, helping prepare dinner. Dr. Foster greeted Fletcher warmly, having long since accepted that his daughter had set her heart on the once solitary rancher. "Might I steal Bridget for a walk before dinner?" Fletcher asked, hat in hand. Dr. Foster's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Just have her back before the potatoes boil over." The evening air carried the first hint of autumn crispness as they walked toward the small park at the center of town. Maple trees were just beginning to turn, their edges kissed with gold and crimson. "You seem nervous," Bridget observed, her hand tucked into the crook of his elbow. "Do I?" Fletcher tried for nonchalance and failed spectacularly. "Fletcher Baxter, in all the years I've known you, I've seen you face down rustlers, blizzards, and my brother's temper without blinking. But right now, you look like you're facing a firing squad." He laughed, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. That was another gift Bridget had given him. Laughter, something that had been scarce in his life for too long. They reached the small bench beneath the largest maple tree, and Fletcher guided her to sit. Instead of joining her, he remained standing, his hands working nervously at the brim of his hat. "Bridget," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. Her eyes were patient, encouraging. "Yes. I've been thinking a lot about walls lately," he said, the words coming easier once he began. "About how I built them to protect myself, not realizing they were a prison of my own making." She nodded, letting him continue at his own pace. "When I met you, well, we were children then, so maybe met isn't the right word. But when you became part of my life, you were the first crack in those walls. You've been chipping away at them ever since, even when I tried to patch them up behind you." Fletcher knelt before her then, taking her hands in his. "I don't want walls anymore, Bridget. I want a home. With you." Her eyes widened as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, hand-carved with delicate flowers that had taken him days to perfect. "I'm not a man of fancy words," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "But I'm asking if you'll marry me. If you'll help me build something better than walls, a life, a family, a future." Tears spilled down Bridget's cheeks as she looked from the ring to his face. "Do you know what this means?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "That I'm finally catching up to where you've been all along," he answered with a smile. "It means you'll never be alone again," she corrected gently. "Neither of us will." "Is that a yes?" he asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Fletcher Baxter, it has always been yes," she said, framing his face with her hands. "Since I was 17 years old watching you ride away, it has always been yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then pulled her into an embrace that promised never to let go. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the mountains wearing their autumn colors like a celebration banner. The entire town turned out, the ceremony held in the small church, and the celebration spilling into the street outside. Fletcher stood at the altar in a new suit, watching as Bridget walked toward him on her father's arm. Her cream-colored dress simple but elegant, wildflowers in her hair instead of a fancy veil. When they exchanged vows, Fletcher's voice rang clear and certain. The walls were gone, replaced by a bridge between his heart and hers. After the celebration, he took her home, not to her father's house or his bachelor cabin, but to a surprise he'd been working on for weeks. Just beyond his original cabin stood a new house, larger and sturdier, with a proper front porch and windows that caught the afternoon sun. "When did you do this?" Bridget gasped as he lifted her from the wagon. "Been working on it since the day after you agreed to marry me," he admitted. "Had help from Abel and some of the men from town. Wanted to give you a real home, not a cowboy's shack." He carried her across the threshold as tradition demanded, setting her down in a front room furnished with pieces he'd either made or traded for. A settee by the fireplace, bookshelves filled with volumes he knew she loved, a rocking chair positioned to catch the best light for reading. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Not quite," Fletcher said, taking her hand and leading her to the back of the house where a final door remained closed. "One more thing." When he opened the door, Bridget's hands flew to her mouth. The room was small but bright with afternoon sun, its walls painted a soft yellow. A cradle stood in one corner, hand-carved with the same flower pattern as her ring box. "Fletcher," she breathed, turning to him with questioning eyes. "I thought, someday," he began, suddenly unsure. "If you want." She silenced him with a kiss that left no doubt about her answer. Spring 1887 found Fletcher Baxter standing on the porch of his home, watching as Bridget moved through the garden with their 3-month-old daughter cradled against her shoulder. Flora Baxter had her mother's eyes and her father's determined expression, a combination that already suggested she would be a force to reckon with as she grew. The ranch had expanded, with hired hands now helping manage the growing herd. The solitary cabin where Fletcher had once hidden from the world still stood, converted now to a bunkhouse for the workers. Life had expanded in all directions, like ripples from a stone cast in still water. As Bridget looked up and smiled at him, Fletcher felt the familiar warmth bloom in his chest, the certainty that he had finally found his place in the world. Not in isolation, but in connection. Not behind walls, but within the circle of arms that held him close each night. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" Bridget asked as she climbed the steps to join him on the porch. Fletcher took his daughter into his arms, marveling as always at how something so small could hold his entire world. "I was thinking about how wrong I was," he said. "About everything that matters." "Well, that's a broad admission," she teased, leaning against his side. "I thought strength meant standing alone," he explained, gazing down at Flora's sleeping face. "But real strength is this, building something together, creating a life that's bigger than just survival." Bridget turned his face toward hers, kissing him with a tenderness that still took his breath away. "You figured it out eventually," she said against his lips. "Thanks to you," he replied. "You never gave up on me." "I never will," she promised, her eyes reflecting the future they would build together. "You've always been the one, Fletcher Baxter. Always." As the Montana sun sank toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Fletcher Baxter stood with his family on the porch of the home love had built, finally understanding that the walls he'd thought would protect him had only delayed his journey to where he truly belonged, in the heart of the woman who had waited patiently for him to find his way home.